only solution that I see is to establish a firm front. And the more resolute the front, the more effective it will be.
In his final days, Nobel Prize winner George C. Marshall, a man once praised as the quiet architect of victory, broke a silence he had kept for decades. Behind the medals, handshakes, and official reports, there was a truth about D-Day he could no longer take to his grave. It wasn't about glory or triumph. It was about something far darker that had haunted him every night since June 6, 1944. What could have been so terrible that even one of the most respected men in history kept it hidden until the very end? Join us in this video as we reveal the details. George Marshall's revelation about D-Day. George C. Marshall was one of the most powerful and respected figures during World War II. As the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, he worked from his office in Washington, planning and directing the entire Allied war effort. Unlike many others in positions of power, Marshall was not a man who sought fame or attention. He carried himself with calm strength, rarely showing emotion, and always focusing on duty. Those who worked around him described him as a man of few words, someone who thought deeply before he spoke. Yet behind his quiet nature, there was always something heavy about him, an invisible weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. Throughout the war, Marshall became known for his incredible discipline and sharp strategic mind. Every part of the Allied military effort, from the battlefields of Europe to the distant islands of the Pacific, bore his influence. While other generals became household names for their victories on the front lines, Marshall stayed in the background, holding the war together with his organizational genius. But beneath this calm image, there was another side of him, a man who silently carried the pain of every life lost under his command. One of the hardest and most defining choices of his career came when President Franklin D. Roosevelt offered him command of Operation Overlord, the invasion that would later be known as D-Day. It was the single most important military command of the entire war. Most men would have accepted without hesitation, but Marshall did not. He hesitated, thought deeply, and then declined. Instead, he recommended Dwight D. Eisenhower for the position. At the time, many believed he did it out of modesty or because he thought his place was in Washington. But later, as more of the truth came to light, it became clear that his decision was driven by something far more personal and far more painful. Marshall understood what the D-Day command would require. He knew that whoever led that invasion would carry the burden of sending thousands of young soldiers into near certain death. He understood that such a mission could destroy a man's spirit completely. So, instead of standing on the beaches of Normandy, he chose to remain in Washington, the silent architect of a plan that would win the war but cost countless lives. Under his supervision, the operation was planned in absolute secrecy. Marshall believed that one careless word could cost thousands of lives. Only a handful of people knew the true details of the invasion, and even among the top generals, some were deliberately kept in the dark. This secrecy caused friction among the Allies, but Marshall stood firm. He believed that too much truth in war could be as deadly as the enemy's gunfire. As part of his strategy, Marshall helped create a massive deception campaign. The goal was to convince the Germans that the invasion would happen at Calais rather than Normandy. Inflatable tanks were built to look real. Fake radio messages were sent. Entire imaginary divisions were created to mislead enemy intelligence. It was a web of lies so convincing that it fooled even some Allied officers. Marshall called deception a weapon of survival. He knew that only through illusion could the real invasion stand a chance of success. Years later, when Marshall was old and frail, he began to speak more openly about D-Day. In one of his final interviews, he revealed that parts of the invasion, particularly the landings at Omaha Beach, were intentionally planned as what he called sacrificial fronts. These areas were designed to draw enemy fire and confusion away from other invasion points. In simple terms, this meant that some units were sent in knowing they had almost no chance of survival. Marshall explained that the secrecy and deception had gone so deep that even some of their own men were misled. Many soldiers believed they would have heavy air and naval support, but that support was never coming. They were told only what they needed to hear to keep the mission moving forward. In his later words, Marshall called it an invisible exchange, lives for silence. He admitted that they had sacrificed parts of the army to protect the larger plan, choosing victory at the cost of truth. This revelation haunted him. He knew it had been necessary for the invasion to succeed, but it broke something inside him. He had spent his entire life serving with honesty and integrity. Yet, in that one operation, he had been forced to hide the truth, not only from his enemies, but from his own men. That kind of secret, once carried, never goes away. It changes a man forever. Marshall's quiet confession revealed that D-Day's triumph came with a price few could ever imagine. Behind the celebration and the victory parades lay a truth built on deception, silence, and sacrifice. It was not betrayal, it was survival, but it left scars that could never fully heal, even for the man who had helped make victory possible. If the victory at Normandy came with such unbearable silence and hidden sacrifice, then how did George C. Marshall spend the rest of his life trying to make peace with the ghosts of the war he helped win? Let's find out. The general who carried the weight of peace. After the war ended, George C. Marshall's name became a sign of strength, leadership, and honor. The world saw him as the man who helped win the greatest battle in human history. Yet those who knew him best could see that he carried something deeper, something that time could not go away. The victory had come at too high a cost, and he knew it. Marshall moved from war into peace, becoming Secretary of State. He used himself to rebuild the world that the war had damaged. Through what became known as the Marshall Plan, he helped send food, supplies, and money aid to ruined countries across Europe. His work gave hope to millions, and for him, it was more than just politics. It was a way to find balance, to give back what war had taken. In secret times, he always said that peace came to balance what victory could not explain. It was his quiet way of saying that no amount of success on the battlefield could ever truly make up for the human cost of war. When Marshall got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953, the world praised him as a man of greatness and integrity. But even then, those close to him saw something different. He did not smile much. He did not bask in the glory. Instead, he accepted the honor with calm dignity, almost as though he viewed it as forgiveness for the things he could never forget. In his later years, he spoke less about the war and more about the value of peace, patience, and restraint. He once said that the only victories worth celebrating were the ones that did not require silence afterward. Those words carried the full weight of his past, the secrecy, the sacrifices, and the invisible cost of D-Day. George C. Marshall's life became a story of both success and sadness. He was the man who helped lead the Allies to victory, and the man who built a broken world afterward. But behind that greatness was a quiet truth, a truth that showed how victory and guilt can exist side by side. He carried the weight of choices that saved nations but broke hearts. In the end, he proved that true leadership is not only about winning wars, but about facing the heavy price of those victories. His story tells the world that peace is not born from glory, but from regret, understanding, and the will to make right what war destroys. And even though Marshall never fully spoke of the pain he carried, history remembers him not just as a soldier or a strategist, but as a man who understood the unbearable cost of silence and spent the rest of his life trying to give meaning to it. After everything the war had already revealed about courage, loss, and leadership, could there still be one final truth? Something so unsettling that even a man as respected as George C. Marshall tried to keep it buried for the rest of his life. Stay tuned for more: The Making of an Extraordinary Leader. George C. Marshall was born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and from a very young age, he showed signs of quiet discipline and determination. Those who knew him as a child often said he was not the kind of boy who stood out in a crowd, but there was something steady about him. something that made people trust him even when he said very little. He admitted later in life that he had not been a brilliant student in school. In fact, by his own words, he was only average in most subjects. The only subject he truly enjoyed and excelled in was history, which he said helped him understand the patterns of human behavior and the rise and fall of nations. When he got older, Marshall made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He enrolled in the Virginia Military Institute VM-1, one of the most respected military schools in the country at the time. I was strict and demanding. The young cadets were expected to show respect, discipline, and complete obedience. Marshall not only handled this pressure well, but thrived under it. His calm attitude, sense of fairness, and willingness to take responsibility soon set him apart from the others. In his final year, he earned the rank of First Captain of the Corps of Cadets, the highest position a student could hold at the institute. This role was given only to the person the whole school trusted most to lead others, and it showed early signs of the steady leadership that would later define his career. After graduating, Marshall decided that the military was not just a temporary job, it would be his lifelong calling. He joined the U.S. Army and began what would become one of the most influential careers in American military history. From the very beginning, he earned a reputation for being calm under pressure, precise in judgment, and deeply loyal to the men who served under him. He had a natural ability to earn respect without ever demanding it, something few officers could manage. In 1906, Marshall attended the Army Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, one of the most advanced military schools in the United States. The training there was deep and needed both mental sharpness and practical understanding of military science. While many fought to keep up, Marshall's instructors saw how naturally he handled hard problems. He later returned to the same school as an instructor, where he taught strategy, organization, and discipline. During this time, he made a deep appreciation for citizen soldiers, ordinary men who set aside their normal lives to serve their country when called. He always said that America's true strength came not from its weapons, but from the courage and sacrifice of its people. When World War I broke out, Marshall served in France with the American Expeditionary Forces. It was during this period that he truly began to change his leadership style. He was not known for loud speeches or dramatic signs. Instead, he led by example, working harder than anyone else, staying calm even when situations turned bad, and always putting his men's needs before his own. He learned firsthand about the harsh cost of war and the importance of logistics, communication, and cooperation among Allied forces. These lessons stayed with him for the rest of his life. By 1927, Marshall's career had bettered enough for him to be made head of instruction at the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia. This was one of the most important turning points in his career. He was no longer just a soldier or strategist. He had become a teacher and a leader. He changed the way the U.S. Army trained its officers. Under his leadership, the school's programs changed from hard textbook lessons to more realistic, hands-on training that made officers for the real conditions of war. The changes he introduced were so good that many of the young officers who trained under him went on to become key military leaders during World War II. More than 200 of his students eventually rose to the rank of general. They proudly referred to themselves as Marshall's Men, a title that spoke not only of his leadership, but also of the deep respect and loyalty he showed. If George C. Marshall carried such a heavy secret about D-Day until his final days, then what exactly was the truth he feared the world wasn't ready to hear? Let's delve deeper. A true legacy of duty and peace. In the early 1930s, Douglas MacArthur, who was one of the most well-known military leaders of that time, praised Marshall by saying, "He has no superior among infantry colonels." This praise was rare, coming from someone as proud and demanding as General Douglas MacArthur. It shows the growing fame of Marshall's intelligence and steady hand inside military circles. By 1938, Marshall was made head of the War Plans Division, and soon after, he became the Deputy Chief of Staff. His clear thinking, honesty, and calm temper quickly caught the attention of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In 1939, Roosevelt made a choice that would change both Marshall's life and the path of world history. He appointed him as the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, the highest-ranking position in the Army. This role placed Marshall in charge of all military planning and preparation at a time when the world was already sliding into chaos. It was not an easy responsibility. The United States was still healing from the Great Depression, and its military was small and less equipped compared to the forces rising in Europe and Asia. Yet Marshall faced the challenge with quiet determination. He quickly began creating a plan for the first peacetime draft in American history, a move that would allow the nation to tightly hold its defenses before it was drawn into world issues. After the war years, Marshall did not retire quietly. His sense of duty to his country remained as strong as ever. He served as a special envoy, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and even the President of the American Red Cross. Perhaps his greatest contribution after the war was what became known as the Marshall Plan. In 1947, while giving a speech at Harvard University, he proposed a bold idea to rebuild the shattered economies of Europe, not through punishment, but through support, compassion, and cooperation. He argued that hunger, poverty, and despair were the breeding grounds of conflict, and that lasting peace could only be built on stability and hope. At first, his proposal faced resistance. Many in Congress were hesitant to invest billions of dollars overseas so soon after the war. But Marshall's honesty and reputation won them over. He was a man known to speak only when he had something worth saying. And when he spoke, people listened. The plan eventually passed, and the United States invested $13 billion, a vast sum at the time, into rebuilding Europe. This effort not only restored the continent's economy, but also strengthened alliances and laid the foundation for what would later become the European Union. In 1953, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee gave him the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in promoting peace through the Marshall Plan. In his acceptance speech, Marshall said something that shows the heavy weight he carried throughout his life. "The cost of war in human lives is always spread before me, written well in many ledgers whose columns are gravestones." These words showed the deep sorrow he felt for the lives lost in war and his love to make sure such sadness never happened again. Even after getting worldwide fame, Marshall stayed humble. He refused to write memoirs, refused to make money from his story, and turned down offers that would have brought him personal gain. He said that his service to his country was not for sale, and that the greatest reward any man could have was to know that he had done his duty with honor. George C. Marshall passed away on October 16, 1959, and was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery. His grave was simple, just like the man himself. Those who visit his resting place always talk on how it is for someone who changed so much of the New World. But maybe that simple life is what makes it powerful. He lived without seeking glory, and in doing so, became one of the most respected leaders of the 20th century. Today, his legacy continues through the George C. Marshall Foundation in Lexington, Virginia, and through every act of leadership inspired by integrity and selflessness. He remains remembered not only as a brilliant strategist and statesman, but as a man of peace, a warrior who understood that the greatest victory of all was learning how to prevent another war. After all the planning and leadership, would the Allies survive the storm waiting on the beaches of Normandy? Let's learn more. Hell on the Beaches, the bloody battle for Omaha. For almost 5 long years, Nazi Germany had been spreading across Europe, taking over countries and bringing fear wherever they went. The Allied forces knew it had to stop, and their plan to do that began in Normandy, France. This plan would become one of the most dangerous and important missions in history. The goal was clear but deadly: take control of a small part of German-held France and start pushing back toward Berlin. Everything depended on the success of that single day. The mission began at night with paratroopers being dropped behind enemy lines. Their job was to clear the way for the main invasion that would come by sea the next morning. But right from the start, things went wrong. The planes carrying the airborne troops were flying faster than planned. Many of the soldiers were dropped in the wrong places, far from their targets. The men of the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment were scattered all over the countryside, confused and unable to contact each other. Radios failed, equipment was lost, and their mission quickly fell apart before it could even begin. Meanwhile, miles away at sea, thousands of troops were climbing into landing boats for the fights on the beaches. Their orders were to destroy the German coastal defenses, take control of the beaches, and move inland toward the city of St. Louis. There were 5 landing zones, each with its own name: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. But one of them, Omaha Beach, would soon become known for the sheer amount of bloodshed and chaos that happened there. The soldiers knew the risks. If the invasion failed, it would take months to plan another, and by then, the Germans would be even stronger. For months, the Germans had been building heavy defenses along the Normandy coast, filling it with mines, barbed wire, and machine gun posts. Many of the Allied leaders believed that the Germans in Normandy were weak and unprepared, but they were wrong. The German forces there were well-armed, experienced, and waiting. When the first wave of Allied soldiers reached Omaha Beach, they stepped into hell. The water was shallow, and at low tide, they had to cross nearly 300 yards of open sand before reaching any kind of cover. As soon as the ramps on the landing boats dropped, the German machine guns opened fire. The MG-42, the main German weapon, fired 20 bullets every second. In only a few moments, entire boats full of men were wiped out before anyone could reach the beach. One soldier said the boat next to his blew up, showering them with pieces of wood, metal, and body parts. The men who made it to shore had to cut off their heavy packs to keep from drowning. Many crawled across the sand with no weapons, trying to reach the seawall for cover. Every time they lifted their heads, bullets tore through the air around them. Some soldiers only survived by moving when the German guns turned in another direction. After 2 long hours of fighting, the situation was desperate. Hundreds were dead or wounded, and those who were still alive were trapped on the beach. In front of them were 150-foot cliffs covered with barbed wire and hidden mines. It seemed impossible to move forward, but there was no choice. One soldier said they had only 3 options: stay on the beach and die, surrender to the Germans, or fight. For the 29th Division, surrender was not an option. A lieutenant led the way, crawling through mud to check for mines instead of ordering his men to do it. His courage inspired others to follow. Inch by inch, they moved forward, clearing paths with tape to mark safe routes through the minefields. It took 11 hours of non-stop fighting before the U.S. forces finally secured Omaha Beach. They had planned to move 10 miles inland that first day, but by nightfall, they had advanced less than 1,000 yards. General Omar Bradley later said how close the invasion came to total failure in those first few hours. By the end of the day, the Allies held only a narrow stretch of beach, 5 miles long and just over a mile deep. It was filled with bodies, destroyed vehicles, and debris, but they had managed to hold it, and that small victory would change the course of the war. Still, the mission was far from over. The next step was to link up with the airborne troops and capture St. Louis. But the Germans were not backing down. They regrouped quickly and began to fight back with incredible strength. The Allies were forced to move through thick hedgerows, dense walls of earth and plants perfect for German ambushes. In the days that followed, the fighting grew even more brutal. Every field, every road, and every corner became a trap. The death toll rose sharply, far higher than what had been lost on the beaches. As the sun went down on June 6, 1944, both sides knew the same thing. D-Day was only the beginning. The hardest battles were still to come, and the cost of freedom would be higher than anyone could imagine. After witnessing the chaos and bloodshed of Normandy, how did the Allied forces manage to build such power and discipline that could stand against Hitler's war machine? Let's take a closer look. How George C. Marshall built America's strongest army. Adolf Hitler's fear of General George C. Marshall did not come from anything that happened on a battlefield. Marshall never led an army in person, never fired a gun, and never charged into battle. Yet, he was one of the few men who truly frightened Hitler. What scared him was not Marshall's presence, but the power he created. Marshall turned the United States from a peaceful country with a small army into the strongest military force the world had ever seen. When George Catlett Marshall became the U.S. Army Chief of Staff in 1939, America's army was very small, less than 200,000 soldiers. In comparison, Germany already had millions of men under arms, all well-trained and ready for war. Many people would have been overwhelmed by that, but Marshall was different. He did not see war as something that could be won by numbers alone. He knew victory would come from organization, planning, and using every bit of America's power, its factories, workers, and resources, to fight as one strong force. From his very first day in office, Marshall began rebuilding the army. He was strict, calm, and honest. He demanded that everyone under him be efficient and disciplined. Any officer who refused to adapt or who lacked skill was quickly removed. He then promoted new leaders who showed creativity and courage. Men like Dwight D. Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and George S. Patton. Hitler's spies took note of this and reported that Marshall was gathering a group of highly capable men who could lead with intelligence and strength. That alone was enough to make the Nazi leader nervous. But Marshall's real power was not just in his choice of generals. His genius was in his ability to connect everything, the soldiers, the factories, and the government, into one massive war effort. He worked with President Franklin Roosevelt and Congress to make sure America had the weapons, ships, and planes it needed. Factories across the country were transformed. Places that once made cars, refrigerators, or typewriters now built tanks, bombers, and guns. Under Marshall's direction, America was able to train and equip millions of soldiers in record time. By the time the United States entered World War II in 1941, the groundwork for a global fighting force had already been laid. Hitler received reports of this transformation and quickly realized the danger. He had believed that America was too slow and too far away to make a difference. But soon, the U.S. began sending troops to North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific. Every operation they carried out was powered by the massive supply system Marshall had built. The numbers shocked Germany. By 1943, American factories were producing more airplanes in 1 year than Germany had made during the entire war. Every time a tank or plane was destroyed, America built 10 more to replace it. Hitler could not compete with that kind of power. Marshall was a man of few words, but firm actions. His officers followed him not out of fear, but out of deep respect. He also believed in teamwork beyond America's borders. Marshall worked closely with Britain and the Soviet Union, making sure the Allies stayed united against the Axis powers. He attended meetings with Churchill and other leaders, calmly explaining plans and offering solutions. His quiet authority reassured everyone. Even Churchill later called him the true architect of victory. For Hitler, Marshall became a nightmare he could never defeat. He could outfight a general in one battle, but he could not outthink the man who built an entire system of victory. While Germany struggled to fight on two fronts, Marshall had turned America into a country capable of fighting on every continent at once. Under his leadership, the United States supplied not just its own army, but also its allies, keeping them armed and fed until the war was won. What do you think about the D-Day revelation? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the next video shown on your screen to catch up on your favorite celebrity stories. See you there.